Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to give you that shortcut to getting informed, finding those aha moments. Today, we're plunging into a really crucial period, European colonization in the Americas. Our mission, really, for this deep dive is to quickly get a handle on the very distinct ways the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English colonies operated, how they developed between 1607 and 1754. We want to give you that foundational look at what made them so different, right down to their basic strategies.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It really is a study in contrast when you line them up. If you look at the Spanish, their whole effort was largely about getting wealth out of the land. This often meant, subjugating native populations, a big push for conversion to Christianity and fitting Native Americans and also enslaved and free Africans into this very rigid hierarchical society. Then you have the French and the Dutch. They brought over relatively few Europeans, actually. Their strategies really depended heavily on trade alliances, sometimes intermarriage with American Indians, basically to build relationships for trade, mainly furs for export. And then the English. They're different again. They brought over a much larger number of migrants, men and women, British and other Europeans. These people were often looking for social mobility, maybe economic prosperity, religious freedom, or just, better living conditions. And their focus, it was agriculture, settling on land taken from Native Americans, and generally they lived quite separately from them.
Wow, that's quite a range of motivations and methods right from the start, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's dive into the details of each one because there are some surprising aspects here. So, starting with the Spanish makes sense. They were the first ones to really get a major foothold in the Americas. When we talk about their core mission, what was the absolute driving force behind it all?
Well, if you had to boil it right down, it was wealth extraction. Simple as that, really. They wanted to achieve this through large-scale agriculture and, of course, mining. But crucially, they weren't planning on doing the hard labor themselves. So to make that happen, they developed these systems. The most famous is probably the encomienda system. It was essentially a grant of indigenous labor, a way to subjugate American Indians for forced work. But that system ultimately failed, really.
Why was that?
Well, for a couple of reasons. Tragically, European diseases decimated native populations. But also, the Native Americans knew the land incredibly well, which made controlling them difficult. So this failure meant the encomienda was gradually replaced by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. And layered on top of this, the Spanish introduced the caste system. This was a really strict social hierarchy based fundamentally on, racial ancestry. It completely reshaped society in their colonies.
And it wasn't purely about economics, was it? There was that strong religious element, too. How did the mission system, aiming to convert natives to Christianity, fit in?
That's a really interesting layer, yes. Because even the religious drive, which was certainly genuine for some missionaries, often ended up serving the broader goals of the empire. The success of the mission system was, well, pretty mixed. Some natives did convert, definitely. Others might have converted outwardly, but secretly kept their own traditions going. And then, of course, you had outright resistance. The Pueblo Revolt is a powerful example of that. I think the key thing to grasp here is just how deeply that core motivation wealth extraction shaped absolutely everything else. Their labor systems, their social structures, even how they implemented, and the mixed results they got from their religious efforts. It was all tied together.
That makes sense. A really crucial link. Okay, so if the Spanish story is largely about conquest control, driven by wealth, how did the French story unfold so differently when they eventually got involved?
Yeah, they definitely took a different path. It's interesting, the French didn't really show significant interest in sailing west until about 1524. And even then, their first goal wasn't actually to settle the Americas. They were trying to find a water route through the Americas.
The Northwest Passage idea.
Exactly, to get to Asia for trade. And their efforts to colonize were also slowed down quite a bit by wars back in Europe, which took up resources and attention, and also by the persecution of Protestant Huguenots within France itself. Many potential colonists weren't allowed to leave or didn't want to. So it was really only after they failed to find that water passage through the continent that they started looking at the Americas itself as a place of interest.
So once they did shift focus, what did French colonization actually look like on the ground? What was their main strategy?
Well, a key moment is 1608. Samuel de Champlain establishes Quebec, their first permanent settlement. But their approach was really different from the Spanish. The French were much more interested in trade, especially fish and furs, which were very valuable rather than outright conquest or large-scale farming settlements.
Okay.
And a major difference Very few French people actually came over compared to the Spanish or later the English. So instead of big settlements, they mostly set up trading posts across North America. And this focus on trade led to a really unique strategy. French traders often married Native American women.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
Yes, and it wasn't just happening randomly. It was often a deliberate tactic to build kinship ties. Those family connections were absolutely vital for getting access to the extensive trading networks run by various Native groups. A really good example is their relationship with the Ojibwe Indians up in the Great Lakes region, modern-day Canada area. The French actively fostered alliances with them. This led to a lot of cultural exchange. For instance, the Ojibwe were incredibly skilled at preparing beaver pelts, which the French desperately wanted for the European market. In return, the French brought in things like iron cookware, better farming tools, manufactured cloth. It was a genuine exchange, really born out of mutual need and economic opportunity.
Okay, yeah, that comparison is stark, isn't it? The French approach, integrating through trade and kinship, versus the Spanish subjugation model.
Hmm.
And you mentioned that focus on trade finds echoes, but also differences with the Dutch. Let's turn there.
Absolutely. The Dutch also started out looking for that water route to Asia, just like the French. They sent Henry Hudson. He didn't find the passage either, obviously, but his exploration up the river, the one now named after him, led the Dutch to claim that part of the Northeast. And by 1624, they'd established a colony there, New Amsterdam.
Which became New York eventually.
Exactly. Now, the Dutch goals were almost entirely economic. New Amsterdam very quickly became this major trading hub. It attracted a really diverse population, traders, fishermen, farmers, people from all over. But here's a key difference, particularly from the Spanish, and actually the English too. The Dutch were Protestant, quite proudly so, but they showed basically zero interest in converting the Native Americans they encountered. Their focus was commerce, building a bustling port city. Religion wasn't really part of their colonial project in the same way.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how those core economic drivers led to such different ways of interacting with the people already living there. For the Dutch, it seems like it was just business, and that shaped everything. Okay, let's shift now to the British. Their story is obviously central to the later development of the United States. What really set their approach apart right from the beginning?
The British model was distinct again, largely because of who was coming and why. They attracted a much larger number of migrants compared to the French or Dutch men and women, mostly British, but also other Europeans. And importantly, these weren't just, lone adventurers or traders. They often came as family groups. Their intention was to establish new homes, new communities, permanently.
And their motivations were broader too, right?
Yes, quite broad. People were seeking social mobility, a chance to improve their station in life. Economic prosperity was a huge driver. Religious freedom was a major factor for groups like the Puritans and Quakers. And for many, it was simply about seeking better living conditions than they had back in England.
You mentioned economics being key even within that broader mix.
Oh, absolutely. The English economy was going through huge changes, partly because of the Columbian Exchange, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Also, England's wars with France and the expensive conquest of Ireland had actually diminished the wealth of many nobles. So they were looking for new ways to make money, new lands.
And it wasn't just the upper classes feeling the pinch, was it? What about ordinary people?
No, exactly. The peasantry was facing massive disruption too, largely because of something called the enclosure movement. This involved common lands, which peasants had traditionally used, being fenced off and sold to private owners, mainly for sheep grazing, actually.
Ah, right. Less land for farming.
Precisely. So you had nobles looking for new ventures, and you had ordinary people desperately needing land and economic opportunity. So many were driven by that need for land, alongside those other motivations like religious freedom or just a fresh start. And given these motivations, land, settlement, building new lives, the English colonists focused heavily on agriculture. And crucially, they settled on land taken directly from Native Americans.
And lived separately, you said?
Yes, by and large, they aimed to live separately. There might have been some initial periods of, let's say, uneasy coexistence, but that often broke down pretty quickly into tension and outright violence as the settlers needed more and more land, inevitably encroaching on native territories. And this is a really key distinction from the Spanish. While the Spanish, in a way, incorporated natives into their system, albeit at the bottom, the English approach tended towards expulsion, pushing them off the land. It's also worth remembering the English landed in areas, particularly New England and the Chesapeake, that didn't have the same kind of large, centralized empires that the Spanish found in Mexico and Peru. There wasn't a single power structure they could just co-opt or coerce easily. This probably made direct conflict over land more likely from the start.
It sounds like a fundamentally different, perhaps more inherently confrontational
Yeah.
approach right from the get-go, driven by that mass migration and the need for farmland. So this really begs the question, how did these different demographics, these different core motivations, settlement versus trade versus abstraction, end up shaping their long-term relationships with the land and the original inhabitants in ways that were so profoundly different across the board?
Okay, so just to quickly pull that together,
Mm.
we've seen these incredibly distinct paths. The Spanish
Mm.
focused on extracting wealth, subjugating populations, often with that strong religious conversion element mixed in.
Right.
Then the French and Dutch, far fewer Europeans, prioritizing trade, building alliances, sometimes through marriage, seeing the Americas primarily as a source of valuable goods like furs.
And trade partners, essentially.
And then the English, bringing large numbers of settlers, men and women, focused on agriculture, taking land, establishing separate communities, which often led to conflict and the expulsion of native peoples. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's so important to stress that these weren't just, minor tweaks in strategy. These fundamental differences in motivation and method created radically different colonial societies in each area. And they completely defined the kinds of relationships or lack thereof that developed with the native populations they encountered and really set the trajectory for everything that followed.
So the big question for us, maybe looking back, what does this all mean? When you think about these incredibly varied starting points, these different ways of approaching a whole continent, what kind of long-term echoes or legacies of these founding strategies do you think we might still be able to see playing out today in the Americas?